Hi everybody, I'm Ryan Macklin and welcome back to Master Plan. On this episode, I'm going to be talking with Mark Richardson of Green Hat Designs, and we're going to be talking about cartography. So, ladies and gentlemen, Mark Richardson!
Thanks, welcome. It's great to be here.
So, we've known each other for the past couple of Gen Cons or so, and I've seen you make really awesome maps, and I know that you're starting to do cartography for other publishers, and you're doing some stuff for yourself. And I wanted to talk as a cartographer who's been doing it in the real world for a while and has been doing it, sort of dabbling in it and becoming more and more into the professional hobby field. I wanted to ask a bunch of questions, sort of get your new take on it, not unlike the indie designers sort of coming in and having very new insights into their field, as opposed to what people have been doing for like 10 years or so. So let's can you tell us a little bit about you as a cartographer?
Sure. I'm formally trained in a field called GIS, which stands for Geographic Information Systems. It's basically computers, mapping, remote sensing, satellites, all that stuff. I went to university at Carleton University way back in '96 to 2000. And when I came out of university, I could have done a lot of different things with my degree, and I ended up working for the federal government up here, doing mapping and correcting maps, and started to be really good at it. And kind of basically I spent about 7-8 years with Natural Resources Canada, and did a lot of really cool things for them. Started getting my name out there a bit in the professional community, and designing some pretty complex projects. A lot of my professional work is more doing posters and that kind of thing, and also like real-world information. So
Sorry, I
land
think
claims.
you might have cut out. At least you cut out
Sorry.
on there, and you were saying most of your real world work is poster.
A lot of my real-world work is either like posters or posters or PowerPoints, because it's the government thing. But yeah, and I've been doing it for about 15 years now. And then about 2 years ago, when I started getting into game design and going to game conventions more regularly and met people like yourself, it wasn't that long after that I bumped into people who like cartography, and I was like, oh, well, hey, I'll bring down some of the stuff that I've done. And then eventually a few people were like, hey, that's really cool. Can you do that for my game?
Right, which is pretty much how it works here in Indie Land. It's like it very much is that meet people at a convention. It turns out a lot of people are cool. It turns out that we want to create really quick jam bands with people and make stuff. So you've been doing that. You were I want to say some of the stuff from Project Dark.
Yeah, so
And I think Will's posted some of that stuff online. Or has he? I honestly, I remember the question, remember to research it. I forgot to actually look into if this stuff was online right now or not.
some things are.
Okay.
So the first sort of completed work I did in the indie community was for Emily Care-Boss. She did a game called King Wen's Tower,
Hmm.
and she wanted a historical map of China, sort of circa 240 BCE kind of thing.
Okay.
It's sort of right when the Chinese dynasty. It's like the creation of the first dynasty by all of the sort of empires fighting over each other.
And that's
Um,
still in that realm of it's a real world map. It's just now it's a very time shifted.
Yeah, exactly. And then my first sort of straight on this doesn't exist job was for Will Hindmarch with Project Dark. And that was literally a case of being at, I believe it was Metatopia, where I was showing off one of my professional works for my day job. And he was like, can you do like that kind of detail or more for like a city? And I was like, okay. And it started off much smaller scope, I think, than what we were ever intending. It's one of those behemoth projects now,
Right.
in the sense that the current the current project is now a 30 by 20-inch poster. There's about 32,000 separate buildings, 360 streets. Um, it's pretty crazy.
And what's the DPI on that? Like, is that like a crazy like 600 DPI poster?
So a lot of the work that I like, so within the field of, I guess, making maps, you essentially have making maps that are like vector.
Okay,
So if you were an illustrator, you might be using Adobe Illustrator
right.
or programs like that. If you were, and then there's raster work, which is like Photoshop and stuff
Right.
like that. The software I use is a program called ArcGIS. And so this is like what people use if they're going to survey your street or make a satellite photo, make Google Earth, that kind of thing. It has a bunch of really cool, powerful features in it because it works in the real world, so it understands the real world,
Mhm.
but it can be tricky sometimes when you're trying to do make-believe with it.
So definitely want to talk to you a bit more about the ArcGIS elements, but since most of our a lot of people who are going to be looking at dabbling into cartography, probably, hey, you can see my cat in the background, probably won't have access to and training for GIS. Let's talk a bit about the creative process.
Sure.
Okay, so going with something that is closer to real world, the map that you made for Emily Care Boss, what were the requirements that you needed to get from her for something that was historical but still, real world in nature?
So for something that's based in the real world, a lot of it is, if it's historical, it would be what time period,
Hmm.
and also what level of detail the client would want it at. So you're going to get a completely different. I mean, one of the way I look at making a map is very similar for fictional or even real.
Hmm.
At the end of the day, for me, it's all about sort of the story your map is trying to tell.
Okay.
So, establishing a narrative through the visual medium. So, with something historical, you want to know, like, well, how do you want it to look? What's important for your story? And it's especially for a role-playing game. You know, if the game is all about this particular kingdom and its interactions with certain players, that has to be the front and center feature in your cartographic work.
Can you
It
explain
doesn't.
more what that like what that would mean?
Hmm. Well, so um, if you were making, I don't know, if you had a project that was like a map of Earth,
Okay.
you wouldn't. You want to, if your story is about Eastern Europe, you want to reorient the Earth and make it front and center. You want to mute the colors of your neighbors. You want to brighten up, create contrast, focus the eye where it needs to be.
Okay.
So that things like that, I think.
Okay. So so with that, with something that is real world based, you're still looking at whatever particular narrative you're focusing on. Um, so that's let me sort of think about how to frame the question. I guess it's like, how does the realism balance with the art? The fact that you're telling a story at the same time, you're portraying facts from at least a certain point of view, if not in some cases sort of general facts of like topology or the topography of geology, things like that. And I'm sure I'm misusing some of those words.
No, that's
Please
all
feel
right.
free to correct me, and so that other people learn from my mistake.
Well,
Uh,
so I mean, the art and the science of it interact in sometimes good ways and sometimes really terrible ways.
okay.
Um, so one of the advantages of using like a modern mapping tool like ArcGIS is that I can bring in layers of information that have already been created. So, for example, the mountainous regions in China are have been measured and recorded. So there is a data set that I can download and click a button and put it on my screen, and I have mountainous shading of the local topography.
Okay.
But the problem is, right, if I want to change that element, if I want to do something to the real world because in this fictional game there's a big fortification that doesn't exist or never existed, or they want that mountain range removed. Then you have to use other tools like Photoshop and go into the image and change things. You have to
Okay.
manipulate the data. Um, it's like you can make a cyberpunk city with a modern city, and in that sense, you're just going to be adding. In some
Right.
cases, like if it's historical, you tend to remove pieces of information that might be in a modern data set. But if
Right.
it's future, you might be like, well, let's add a couple 100,000 roads or something like that.
Right. Well, I can see you definitely looking to add in there too. I mean, as you're removing stuff that is more modern, you still have relics or just sort of interesting points that you're trying to put in as well. So it sounds like in a lot of ways then that ArcGIS has that layering feature that like Illustrator does, that Photoshop does. So there's um, a lot of overlap at least in that skill.
Yeah. The way I look at it is you generally end up with uh, two predominant types of cartographers within the RPG community. You have the vast majority of people who are artists who have an interest in cartography.
Hmm.
So that'd be people like Mike Schley, who does a lot of the maps for D&D and whatnot. And so their style is generally, I mean, their styles vary a lot, but it starts as an illustrative style, so it's completely free form. You can do whatever you want. You end up with a you end up with a certain aesthetic, which is that it looks like very hand drawn. Probably like three-dimensional features or castles and things like that. The style that I'm using generates work that is more technical looking. So it tends to look a bit more like something that might have circulated as a map of London in the 1800s kind of thing.
Okay.
So I generally aim for a slightly, at least to stay with the strengths of the software, is to go for a more realistic portrayal, like in terms of how it might be there. Because mostly my thinking is if the client wants that sort of not playful is the wrong word, but if you want to have a really cool like old D&D look to something with cross-roofed cottages and things like that, and you want to have that like artist look, you're going to go hire the artist to do this.
Right.
But if you want to do, say, what Will Hindmarch did, where he said, I want to have a city that looks like it could be real. I want to have every building that is on that city to be there. So, go create, and
Right.
so you end up with something that's more technical. And actually, one of the things that we're bumping into on Project Dark, because we're still working on it, is that it looks almost too perfect.
Mhm.
That the contrast and the colors and the lines are so sharp and poppy that we're like, okay, we need to actually we need to beat this thing up a bit to make it look a little older.
So what is your process for that? I mean, you're going from, excuse me, you're going from software that's designed to make things very conventional looking for a government and corporate audience to something that is an inspiration tool and a narrative tool, um, even more than an informational tool. So what do you do to well, as you say, beat it up?
Well, so in some cases that's bringing in and replicating older styles of cartography. So something I've been using a lot recently is a thing called vignettes. So if you look at sort of like 17th, 18th century maps, there were a lot of maps that have like these lines that come off the coastline. And either they tend to sort of bleed away kind of steadily or sort of straight edge. Sometimes they're referred to as coastal rakes.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that I've been doing and with Project Dark is instead of using like modern tools, like I would create like a series of lines that expand away from the coast and sort of smudging them out. So essentially, you end up replicating an effect that was used, say, 300-400 years ago to denote the contrast of the coastline, except you use it. So that's like kind of some kinds of tools that I use. So that's within the software. And then what we're also doing is once the whole project is completed, we're bringing it into Photoshop and import and layering in like paper textures and that kind of thing to give it like more of an aged kind of look.
Okay. So what you end up exporting out of ArcGIS is a vector that you then play around with in for like either Photoshop or Illustrator.
Yeah, basically. And
Okay.
then either at some point in time the file becomes gigantic.
Right, right. Especially if you once you manipulate it in Photoshop, then it becomes ridiculous because at that point you're rasterizing it to do a lot of stuff.
Yeah, at
Um,
that point you have like a 300 dpi 30 by 20 poster,
right.
and yeah, it's about
That
I don't
that's
know.
you just cut out.
All right. Yeah, then yeah, you end up with like 200 or 300 meg files and stuff like that.
Right. Well, yay, Dropbox.
Yeah.
Um, okay, um, so let's see. You've talked a bit about the map you've done for Emily Carbos. You talked a bit about the map you've done for Will Hindmarch. What have you done for yourself? I understand that you've played around with this sort of thing for like your own home games and stuff like that. Surely not to the same detail, but what have you done for yourself?
Uh, well, I've done geez. I've done a couple of things. What I actually, one of the things that I started on, I kind of totally forgot about this when I was talking to you earlier, but I used to play Counter Strike, which is a video game back in, geez, I guess early 2000s or something like
Yeah,
that.
that takes me back to my college years.
Yeah, exactly.
So what was
And
a first-person shooter, or was it one of the top-downs?
it was a first-person shooter.
Okay, right.
And I was when I was in university, I was like, I really love playing this game, and so I would like make I made two-dimensional blueprints of the maps that we were fighting on, and then uploaded them because there was a lot of clan play and competitive
Right.
active play, and I actually got web hosted on a website called Counter Strike 2D, and like over the course of a couple of years, got like 5 million web hits or something like. It was just crazy. Like it was stupid, nuts university stuff.
Right.
That of course I made nothing on. It was all for exposure, fun, completely
Yeah.
taken advantage of, that
Well,
kind of thing.
at this, well, I mean, also at this point, if you're, if you weren't working, for the actual people behind Counter Strike and you made money off of it, that would be its own set of legal problems.
Well, yeah.
So, uh, that's the time when I think for exposure is probably at least legally best.
Yes.
Just like,
So I got into doing sort of spending more of my personal time on things like that, stuff that
right.
I had an investment in, and I've always been the local GM in my games with my friends running Dungeons and Dragons or Earth Dawn or what have you that. So a lot of times I've put together various fantasy maps, usually fairly simple things like nothing to the level of multiple months of work. But like a lot of people like to see maps are very powerful for communicating ideas.
Mhm.
If you talk about people and say, "Hey, well, so the continent was broken in half by a falling god" or something like that, it's a lot more evocative if after saying that you put down a map in front of people that shows the continent and there's a giant chasm in the middle of it, and you show where everybody is. Yeah, so I've been doing a lot of stuff like that. And whenever I've gone to conventions and stuff like that, I generally put together maps for things. I did a thing not that long ago for I ran a Aliens game using unknown armies
Ooh,
and as the
you're
rule
speaking my
set.
language, yeah.
Yeah, and so it was gritty and horrible and everything, and I was like, hey, well, let's like recreate the alien colony, and so I grabbed moon, it was, yeah, imagery from the moon, and brought it in, and then created like the leftovers of the compound. So the moon crater was actually like the what was left of LV-426 kind of thing.
Hmm. Okay.
And yeah, and you if you lay that down on the table at a con, you get people's attention and players get focused in on things.
There was a convention game I used to run years and years ago, which more or less actually kind of got me started in my game design career, where it was at Gen Con SoCal. like basically across the street from Disneyland, although it's a really vast, huge street. I went and got a bunch of maps of Disneyland, and they were all like trying to escape a zombie uprising in that started in the Pirates of the Caribbean ride. And watching them open up maps and get tactical with these tourist maps was some of the most like powerful and inspiring play. Like watching them open it up and just be like, people are like, well, what if we can try to escape from the monorail in Tomorrowland? Like Tomorrowland is dead. Tomorrowland's dark. We're dead there. It's like watching that people play with maps is fascinating. So, what are some ways that you would look at, or sort of like specific ways you've played with, or have seen really well done, maps as direct player play aids versus
Okay,
maps that
so
are like GM inspiration?
okay, so I think the thing is a lot of times, yeah, what you're talking about is like players look down at a map, and a lot of times they'll be like, why is that tower fallen there? And especially story gamers, they'll create something like maybe the map just had a fallen tower, but now it's like the Witch King's lair or something like that. I did a project for myself. I ran a game set in the Fallout universe. And I did set in the city of Ottawa where I live. And I made two maps. I made one map which was Ottawa in a post-apocalyptic wasteland with nothing on it. And I made another map for myself, which had where, sort of in the style of the computer game, all of the little information nodes of where activities could take place. And basically said, all right, where do you want to go? And the players were like, hey, there's a subway here, let's go there. And and then they would create things, and then they would have encounters and plot new things. I think a lot of times, I'm trying to think with some games, a lot of times games, there's what you make as the map, and then what people use it for will be completely different things. It's like even looking at 13th Age, which has a beautiful world map. I put that down in the table when I ran it, and the hill valley thing that doesn't it's more interesting when things don't have labels and you're not telling everybody and beating them over the head, this is what this thing is.
Okay.
It's much more interesting, I think, to have if you have a chasm that sort of looks like a demon's face, you don't have to put a label on that. You don't even have to put history on that. The players will do that for you.
Okay. So in a lot of ways, you're talking about putting some seed of information, but still, to use one of the story game terms, to leave blanks.
Yeah, you're leaving story hooks. Okay. So if you make a map, so in Project Dark, there's 360 roads. So the roads have names, the names have meanings. The intersections of certain streets might have certain things going on with them. There's one part of the city where we decided that it was burned away in a big fire, so when they rebuilt it, the streets are all higgledy-piggledy all over the place. And so you can see that just by looking at it, that there's this whole part of the city that's completely different than everything else, and there's reasons for that, but it's not really explained explicitly. There's no big label that says this is where the fire took everything out.
Have you ever done a dungeon map or anything like that?
I've done a little bit. It's not totally my cup of tea. I'm always the other day I was playing a regular 5e game, and at one point someone was like, all right, hey, Mark should make the map because we're in the dungeon. And I'm like, no, hell way. I make maps all week. Somebody else is doing this. And then the fellow who started making the map, though, he starts writing it down like directions you would give someone, like 3 feet left, 4 feet right, or something. And I just lost it. And I was like, all right, here, give me the piece of paper, I'll draw it.
But it doesn't sound like it'd be your cup of tea for doing any sort of for if I had a random dungeon, I'd be like, hey, Mark, make this thing for me. You probably would well, you're gonna have to make it really interesting, or otherwise I'm gonna get bored. Is that kind of your vibe, or is it just
I don't know. I've never really tried it.
Okay.
Sort of encounter styles.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think if I've done anything like that.
Or
A
I
lot of
mean,
this.
or is it the sort of thing where it's so different from city maps and stuff like that that it just really hasn't hit you yet?
Yeah, I think that's it, like in some ways like it would take well to the software.
Okay.
It's not something I've never really done. I've always been doing a lot of. I think part of it is that in my day job, I do a lot of national planning kind of things. So
Okay.
most work I do is at like a macro, the whole country kind of thing. And
Right.
so sometimes when I get right into the nitty gritty, I'm like, where am I anymore? What am I doing?
Right.
Um,
I remember the map that you showed me. I think was like an Arctic Circle
yeah.
sort of vibe there, which had that weird moment of like, right, because the Arctic Circle is actually important to Canada. It sort of had
Yes,
like
exactly.
so like fascinating, like just the little shifts in perspective, and it sort of leads to the idea of you talked a bit about like the story your map is trying to tell. And we all know sort of little tricks, like if you invert the North and South Pole to not make it Eurocentric, and other things like that. What sort of tricks would you use, or have you used, to shift the perspective and to sort of like tell a story by that sort of means?
Well, I'm doing a map right now for No Country for Old Kobolds, which recently kickstarted by Steve Wallace,
Mhm.
and the goal of that map is to be like um, a general setting of fantasy kind of topography, and I'm actually uh, trying something as an experiment because I'm like, well, just you don't learn unless you try, and so I've taken compilations of mountains from around the world, and essentially I'm reorienting them and paint using Photoshop to paint them onto each other, and so like colliding the Rockies with the South American
Andes.
mountains and things like the Andes, yeah.
Yeah.
And so putting them next to each other so they're no longer what they used to be, and but they still look really cool. I'm trying to think of other things I've done. There's certainly a lot of things you can do with real world information in terms of shifting it around. Figure out like if you wanted to do like receding coastlines or something like that. Um, I've seen a lot of cool stuff of like you get like Pangaea style things, where it's like before everything was moved around.
Right.
Um, you can easily move objects and recreate things. The Project Dark map, for example, is actually built over the city of Chicago,
Of course it is.
I'm using like in some of the cases I was like, well, I need 1,000 little dwellings, so let's grab polygons out of the city of Chicago kind of thing. So
Okay.
because there's a lot of open information that's very easily available, so you can grab something that was meant for something else, tear it apart, put it back together, so it's no longer really recognizable, and repurpose it.
So when you say that there's a lot of open information, I assume you mean like open license information.
Yeah.
Where would one find some of that stuff?
Well, it depends on the country you're in.
Okay.
The U.S. is really good, probably I'd say better than Canada, because the U.S. federal government has a lot of policies like if information is created by the government, it's free to all its citizens. In
Hmm.
Canada, it's kind of true, but not explicitly. So
You cut out
most
again.
countries, there's a big. Sorry.
You cut out again.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Go back a couple seconds.
So a lot of the U.S. government has a lot of open data. Canadian government has a lot of open data. You can a lot of the regional municipalities. So if you have games in cities, it's incredibly easy to get like every road in the city of New York. Download it in 20 minutes, and create your post-apocalyptic New York game.
Cool.
Something I did with Urban Shadows actually is getting road networks from around the country. Some countries are very, very difficult to work with sort of real world information, like in terms of availability. Like Japan's information is really difficult to get into and figure out. Certainly, language barriers don't help, but yeah, there's a lot of like if you just even look open data and what you're looking for. Like I know Canada has just like a opendata.gc.ca kind of thing, and the U.S. has very similar sites.
Um,
NASA has a lot of cool stuff.
nice. Are those sort of things where I could grab links from you and I could put them into the show notes?
For sure. I have
Fantastic.
I have a, I have a gigantic bookmark of all sorts of places you can go.
Awesome. So we'll do that. I'll make the note. So we've got so I've got a few minutes here, and I've got a bunch more questions that people have submitted online. So let me go ahead and ask some of those. So, what advice do you have for budding cartographers? And I guess I don't know if that would be from your perspective as like a GIS person looking to like play around with RPG maps, or if you have advice for illustrators looking to get into the business. But sort of, what advice would you give to like you 2 or 3 years ago?
So from an RPG perspective,
Sure.
probably a little
Yeah,
bit
yeah,
easier.
yeah.
Uh, Go to conventions. You're not going to like so much of this industry is based on meeting people and talking about things, and I think on average, a lot of the contracts I've gotten to do work have been because I explain what I do for a living, and they explain what they're doing, and then the important lesson to learn is to put back in your head, how could I help someone with this? So if how could a map help this game? So if they show you the draft of their game, so for example, when Emily Care-Boss showed me her early draft of King Wen's Tower, there was a page in it that was like a Wikipedia download of like an old craptastic map,
Mhm.
and I was like, hey, I can do this, and that created a whole conversation. So there's that. Definitely, Twitter, all the usual tools of social media engagement.
Sure.
In terms of, I guess, expose yourself to what different people have done. There's a lot of really cool resources out there. There's a really big Google Plus community on mapping and games. There's a lot of people who really like maps, even if they don't totally know how to make them.
Uh,
And sorry.
so what RPG cartographers sort of inspire you, or that styles you like, and why?
Hmm. I did a panel last year at Gen Con with a whole bunch of people. Jared Blando, Mike Schlee. Some of the names are eluding me right now, but and it was really interesting because there was about 4 or 5 of us, and we all went about it kind of creatively, somewhat similarly, but the tools were completely different. Even amongst the people who used Photoshop, they used different things to get the same job done. Some people were doing it on tablets, some people are doing it on hand. I really find, I love Mike Schlee's stuff that he's done for D&D. He did all the maps. I think he did all the maps for the new 5th edition of Dungeons and Dragons that were in the core book. Absolutely love what he does. I think partly because there's no way I can do it. Because it's just like looking at this. I wanna. One of the things I really is on my to-do list is to learn how to do some of these illustrative techniques and get into drawing a bit more, and then playing around with it in the digital world to sort of try to merge the more traditional rule-driven approach that my software has with a bit more Photoshop and Illustrator and kind of that kind of thing.
Okay. So, excuse me. So are there any maps in games that you can think of, like specific maps, or sort of like what you believe are like hallmarks, or you can like sort of take lessons from, or just like you just love?
I think, my favorite map is like maps that are in the Lord of the Rings books,
Okay.
and like in The Hobbit and stuff. And one of the things that I really like about them is that, like, in terms of going back to what I said earlier about, your map is about a narrative. Like, in this case, I mean, The Hobbit gets the benefit that, it was a written story, so the author knew where his direction was going. But I mean, when you're making campaign notes of like the evil King Sauron, you kind of know where the adventures are going to go. And I really like how it has just enough information on those maps to give an idea of what this forest might be, or that there's some crazy mountain here, but there's no um, the the imagination is still left to wander and decide what it is. And I really like that on maps. I really like the 13th Age map that was recently produced. I do not know the author of it, but it is. I was very impressed with it. Just because of that, like there was some labels on there, and there was, if you go in the text, there's some information about it, but then there's large swaths, and there's all sorts of little details. There's little villages and burned out places, and that's it. Like the GM and the players get to have fun in that sandbox, and that's my favorite kind of map.
Okay. So I'm let's see, I'm a creator, which is actually true, but hypothetically I'm also a creator. I have this idea for a world, which is true, but hypothetically I have an idea for a world, and I want to talk with you about making a map, which again is also true, but hypothetically. What sort of details would you ask of me once we sort of, after we get like the initial conversation going of, hey, you think this idea is cool? Um,
Uh, in a lot of ways, conversations about map design are very similar to conversations about art in games.
okay.
Um, in a lot of cases, actually, from at least the financial perspective, cartography generally shares the similar rates and budgeting that art has, with the exception of when you go past something that fits in a book and something that's like a large poster that requires a lot more work.
Okay.
With a lot of its scope, it's figuring out what's important to your story. What are, like, sometimes it's just so the map for Project Dark started with I said, well, draw me, and I pretty well said, will draw me like a terrible map, but get your idea on there. Like, if you want to have an island in the middle of that and then you want to see, just draw the blob with water around it, because then I know that's what you want. It's a lot easier. Like, we have big ideas, and the key is to get your ideas into something that we can both understand and talk around.
Sure.
So a lot of times I get people to draw up the world's shittiest map, and then I will actually make my version of their world's shittiest map, and it will still be the world's shittiest map. It'll just be digital or something like that, and then we start talking on what we want to do with it.
Okay.
Project Dark's the best example I can think of where this process went on, because what we did is we made that really simple map, and then I said, okay, well, what's the history of this world? Like, this is like the pitch was the city that existed for like thousands of years. So what's changed? Where did it start? Let's go there, and let's build the city from the castle that it began with. And so I got about 2 pages of essentially not even art guidance, but just like history writing in terms of this is where the city began, and then that's reflected in the way that the map was created, so that the road structure changes and moves around and becomes more fluid in certain spots or more rigid in other spots, and that sort of helps tell and reflect that story.
And that's the sort of thing that, like, you've picked up at, like, your time at university and your time in the real world, just because the maps you've done have inherent history to them, because it turns out that Earth has existed for more than like 30 years.
Yeah, I mean, you're always going to have back and forth with the client is the most important thing. I don't want to
just froze again.
Sorry, going back and forth
No,
between the client and yourself is paramount to making a map. I think it probably requires a slightly better working relationship than a lot of art design, in the sense that, especially for big concepts, because you don't want to go off and create something that's completely the opposite of what they wanted.
Sure.
But on the same note, some things, once you get the direction, you can just kind of blast it off.
Do you feel like there are any sort of common questions or common confusions or sort of common points that you've had to deal with or talk about with the various maps you've done for creators?
I'd say usually level of complexity, like what level of complexity you can actually get away with that people can understand. So a lot of times people are like, I want to see a map of a city, and I'm like, all right, well, how much detail do you want? It's like, well, I want to be able to read the streets. Okay, well, in order to read the streets, then the text is maybe like a 10-point font, right? So it means your street is maybe, I don't know, like a zero point 0.3 inches wide or something like that. There's only so much you can fit on a 6 by 9 page. I find a
Right.
lot of times it's about deciding what the scope of the project is. Like if you want a city and you want to fit it on a 6 by 9 page, you're going to see it in a very simplistic way.
Mhm.
If you want to if you want that detail, we can make that detail, and we can either zoom in on where the action is important, or pull away, and and get the big picture. And so I usually try to. I find like a lot of maps that I've worked on have either started smaller or bigger and changed in sort of their scale as the discussion kind of moves forward.
Okay. How easy or difficult is it to change scale in either direction? I mean, I'm sure
Uh,
it's work, but like, how much do you have to redo stuff?
it would depend on the kind of project that it is. So I try to set my scale at the beginning of the project. And because I'm using a program where it's actually based in the real world, I can tell actually telling me
Uh,
how the scale is changing.
okay.
So um, uh, scale's really tricky. I guess in terms of the amount of redo, it depends whether if you've done vector elements, which will
Okay.
scale easily, then those you don't generally have to redo. You may have to change the symbols on them. So like if you had a road that you had symbolized to be really, really thick because you were really close to it, but it was still functionally just a line, then you don't have to move that line if you pull away. Just have to make the road less thick. But if you have like hill shaded topography, so it looks like 3D mountains kind of thing.
Mhm.
That looks really good and really tight at a certain scale. But if you get too close, it starts to get really grainy. And if you get too far away, it's too busy. And that's usually the thing that tends to happen the most with real world information is that
Okay.
you pull away from it, and it's just like if you look at the city of New York and you pan back far enough, it's just like a big blob of streets, you know.
Right. Okay. So we're getting toward the end here. Is there any sort of obvious cartography question that I haven't asked you?
I don't think so. You don't have to put. You can break a lot of cartographic traditions when you're doing fictional stuff. You don't have to always have a lot of people are classically taught to always have a north arrow and always have specific detailed legends and things like that. Depending on what you're doing, you don't necessarily need that. Like it depends on your audience.
Right.
Depending on your world, there might not be a north. So,
Right.
um,
Well, there's also like because of the form factor of these being in books, sometimes your north is toward the spine or or usually toward the edge of the book, just because you're looking for a portrait orientation, but you're dealing with or a landscape orientation, but you're dealing with a book. I know that we've done that sometimes at my day job, where it's like, well, we would really like to have north go forward because that's more or less our house style as far as cartography goes, or north going up. But this time, north's going to go outside of the book. Um,
yeah, and so things like that, you have to be flexible in that thing. Um, um, yeah, I don't think we've really not missed anything. The
cool.
only other thing I'd say is like if you're interested in getting into this, you have to have it's good to have an understanding of like traditional printing methods in terms of how things ultimately like file formats you need to have things in and
Mhm.
stuff like that, CMYK and all that. It's
Okay.
good to get your background in that.
Okay. So you are coming up on launching your own game called Headspace. Let's talk briefly about that, and then we'll probably wrap up here.
Sure. Uh, so Headspace is because you hang around game designers long enough, and they start to wear off on you,
Uh,
and the next thing you know, you're designing a game.
my
Uh,
wife has a different term for that, which is she calls it an STD, but that's not necessarily what's happening here.
no, I always like the story that you get somebody else to design a game, and theoretically that will let you stop designing games. And this is, of course, a blatant lie.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, no, I started working on a game design for a Game Chef about 2 years ago now. and I came up with a neat idea about shared consciousness, and everything else was terrible. And then I went to Gen Con afterwards. It was my first Gen Con, and I had a great conversation with a bunch of folks, and they challenged me to pitch my idea, and I did. And the idea is, and that's what the game has become, is a cyberpunk role-playing game about shared consciousness. So in this world, you are all playing hyper-competent badasses, like you're all Jason Bourne kind of level of skill. And you have a technology that is wired your brains together and allows you to share your knowledges and experiences. Uh, Essentially, what this means is that you can use each other's skills in the fiction. So each character in this game has 3 skills, and you can use any of the other players' skills that are in the party. And when you do that, the only catch is that everybody has emotional baggage, and so when you do things with other people's skills, their emotions can come into your narrative and change the fiction.
Okay. And that is called Headspace, and that will be kickstarting in March
Yeah, March
this year.
10th. March
Fantastic.
10th.
March 10th,
And
2015, because
yeah,
this will be recorded and put up on the audio later too. Okay, so cool. I'm looking forward to seeing that. I know you've been working with some fantastic people there. Do you have any of your own maps in it?
yeah, actually, there's one of the components of the game is sort of dystopic future settings, and there's 2 that are in the game at the beginning. Right now, there's a Vancouver Aftermath, which is sort of post-tsunami Vancouver, and there is 0 Hour in the Promised Land by Shoshana Kessock, that is a setting set in Israel that is sort of like a UN-occupied state.
Mhm.
And in both of these cases, I've created maps. And like I'm going to do stretch goals with the Kickstarter, and hopefully I'll get to do a bunch of other maps of settings because that's something I really like to do.
So the Vancouver one, is that more or less a city map or a region map? And the same question for the 0 Hour one.
So for Vancouver, I took the city of Vancouver and then essentially created like a disaster zone warning sort of system for it, where to sort of model what parts of the coastline have been ripped apart by the tsunami and where the corporations have occupied. Essentially, this in the story of Vancouver, all of the rich land gets wiped out, and so the corporations retreat inland a little bit and force all the poor people into the disaster zones. But of course, 6 months later, the companies are eyeing reclaiming their territory, and things get complicated. With Israel, that's more of like the nation. So
Okay.
that's like a single map, just sort of with large sort of zones kind of thing on it.
Okay.
Uh, but yeah, the stretch goals in terms of authors and cities, like it's everything from cities to entire continents. So
Cool. All right. So looking forward to that. I know some of the people who've been working on that have been pretty excited. But I will go ahead and ask you one final question. So, Mark, what is your master plan?
my master plan is to get published this year. Um, it's been something that's been my master plan for at least 2 years now, and it's finally coming together. And it's exciting and terrifying. And I just really want to have like a printed book of my own design. And I think my master plan though would be to then make a game after that, and keep doing this.
Yeah, I found the first book I put out was in 2007, and I've put out books and helped people put out books since then. And it turns out that there's not really a point where you're done.
Yes.
So I wish you the best of luck in enacting your master plan and in the recovery of it afterwards when you are fed up with publishing and you just sort of want to like rage quit and table flip. Definitely the best of luck in you recovering from that. But yes, ladies and gentlemen, Mark Richardson.
Thank you very much.